Good afternoon and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ashley Graham Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Honors College at Florida Atlantic University. She holds a BA in Astronomy and Physics, very different, and a Ph.D. in Philosophy from the University of Virginia. Ashley works primarily in the areas of philosophy of medicine, global justice, and biomedical ethics. She's currently working with a film editor at National Geographic to produce a documentary on child labor in Myanmar, and that's also the topic of today's presentation. With that, welcome, Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be able to talk about a research topic that I care deeply about for many reasons. So with that, I will start right in. I'll try to keep this talk to 30 minutes or so, maybe 35 minutes, so that there's adequate time for Q&A. So I'm sure many of you have been hearing about Myanmar in the news recently. This is where Myanmar is located. It's next to Thailand and China. It's also known as Burma. Some of you might know it as Burma. So Burma is actually the largest country in mainland Southeast Asia. There are 130 national races that each have their own language that live there. So it's a very, very diverse country. It's mostly Buddhist. About 97% of the people are practicing Buddhist. It was colonized by the British in 1886. After 3 wars between England and Burma over 60 years, Burma won its independence in 1948. And then there were 12 years of civil war. In 1960, this will sound familiar, the military took over the country by force, by coup. And for 50 years, Myanmar was ruled by this oppressive, really oppressive military regime. In many ways, Myanmar was a lot like North Korea during that time. Things were really bad for the people. But around 2010 or so, things started to change. And in 2015, the first democratic election in Myanmar was held.
Ashley, sorry to interrupt. I don't know if we're supposed to see your screen. We don't see your screen at the moment.
Oh, you can't see the screen. Thank you for telling me. Yep, let's see. Okay, so there is the picture of Myanmar next to Thailand. And here is a picture of what I'm about to talk about now. So the first democratic election was in 2015. The second democratic election was just this past November of 2020. And the military party did not win as they wanted to. And so they took over by force again on February 1st. And since then, this is a pretty recent picture, there have been peaceful on the side of the civilians protests, but over 700 unarmed citizens have been killed by the military in just the last 2 months. So things are really difficult in Myanmar. I'll talk more about that. It's not the main focus of my talk, but it does factor into the project that I'm working on and the ways in which we hope to move forward. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background in any case. And also, I know that many of you have probably heard about this in the news already. So right now, the situation is the military says in 1 year, we're going to hold elections and we'll do everything democratically again. But given the history, many people are worried, both inside and outside of Myanmar, many people are worried that that might not be the case, unfortunately. So that's a little background about the country and what's going on right now. But I want to begin the philosophy part of this talk by explaining to you how I personally became interested in the problem of child labor in general and the problem of child labor in Myanmar in particular. So I'll give you a longer answer to that question, but the short answer of how did you become interested in this topic is I experienced it, I saw it firsthand. So in the summer of 2015, I was on the way to China to teach in a summer school there. And I stopped over for a few days in Yangon, which is the largest city. It's not the capital, but it's the largest city in the country. And I had jet lag, not surprisingly. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, this is a picture of the actual tea shop. Nothing is open except for tea shops, and people go very early and drink tea and eat breakfast. And so I was doing that at this tea shop, and I was served my tea by a boy who looked to be about 8 or 9 years old. And later, when I went back to the place where I was staying, I told a local friend there, hey, this morning I got up really early because I was jet lagged, and I was served by the child of the shop owner at the tea shop across from your apartment. And she just kind of shook her head at me and said, if you were served by a child, that's definitely not the child of the shop owner. That is a child who is bussed in from the countryside, who works 12 hours a day, who sleeps on the floor at night alongside other child laborers, who may never see his parents or family again, but the parents will be paid directly for his work, and the parents will use that to eat and to pay for housing. And I was struck by that, not because there was a child laborer in the world. Of course, I knew that already. What I was struck by is the fact that it was not hidden. It wasn't in a factory underground or something like that. It was completely out in the open. And no one seemed to think that there was any problem with it. And I kept thinking about this. I kept thinking about it during my first stay there, which is just a few days. It wasn't just in tea shops. I saw children on the side of the road at construction sites carrying bricks, for example, on the street selling vegetables, for example. It was definitely very present and very much accepted. And when I got home, I thought, well, it's an interesting dynamic. I'd heard about child labor in places like Vietnam and Cambodia, where it's quite hidden. So I'm going to read all the scholarly literature there is about child labor in Myanmar, but I couldn't find anything. And I thought, okay, that's strange. Wonder why no one is working on this topic. Maybe it's because the country has been closed for so long. No one could get in to study the topic. And then I had this idea, maybe a little bit crazy, but not too crazy, I hope, that maybe empirically informed philosophy, I'll tell you in a moment what that is, might be useful in trying to at least understand this problem in Myanmar in particular. Okay, so what is empirically informed philosophy? Well, I am a philosopher. Sometimes people ask me to define what philosophy is. That's extremely difficult to do. But I think of philosophy, other philosophers may disagree, but I think of philosophy as a method that you can apply to pretty much any domain. So I was trained first in astrophysics, as Karen said in the introduction. So my background is as a scientist. What's different about philosophy than science, for example, or history, for example, is it's not confined to a domain. It gives you a set of tools that you can apply, I think, to any domain. Now, empirically informed philosophy in particular uses both theory and empirical investigation. So the theory part is what we might think of, or what most people might think of when they think of philosophy. What is philosophy? Well, people come up with theories about things. That's true. But empirically informed philosophy, which is a relatively new movement in the discipline, is when you take theory and empirical investigation, you put the two together with the goals of trying to understand or explain problems and propose potential solutions to them. So I think of empirically informed philosophy as having two sorts of tools used towards two sorts of goals. And if you've heard of applied philosophy, you might think of empirically informed philosophy as a subcomponent of applied philosophy. So applied philosophy is what philosophers do when they take philosophy sort of out of the ivory tower of academia, so to speak, and apply it to real world problems. Empirically informed philosophy does that and adds empirical investigation on top of that. So I had this idea that maybe I could do some empirically informed philosophy. So I applied for and received a small grant from the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative, which is here at FAU. I was also fortunate to gain the support of the International Labor Organization as part of the United Nations. They were generous in sponsoring a visa for me, and I was able to go back to Myanmar about a year and a half later. And on that next trip, with the help of a translator, That's Christine, that's her English name, and she's pictured here. I was able to interview many children, child laborers, parents, NGO workers, government officials, so on. We traveled all over the country. This is actually a picture of a boat that we took to one village. It looks like it's going to sink. It didn't sink. I felt like it was going to sink. It didn't, but we traveled to rural areas. We traveled to urban areas. We traveled all over the country. And I'll tell you a bit more about some of the things that we found out. But the conditions were quite difficult. This is a picture of an actual hut we slept in. We literally slept with pigs in this hut. Together, we shared that mosquito net because we only had one. You know, we really spent time living with people and talking to them and trying to understand what it's like to be a child laborer or a parent that sends your child to work in Myanmar. So I want to show you now a very short video that explains a bit more about that trip. And after I show you this video, I want to talk about some of the theory behind what we discovered. So
I spent the month of December in Myanmar studying child labor. While there, I met with children and parents in their homes. I asked them about their experiences with work, school, and life. I met one mother who sends her 8-year-old son to work at a construction site in Yangon 7 days per week. He leaves every morning on a public bus at 5:30 a.m. and returns at 7 p.m. The surface reason for child labor in Myanmar is, of course, poverty. Parents are not able to make enough money to feed their families on their own, so they send their children to work. One might be tempted to think that with more education, children might grow up to get better jobs and eventually escape from the cycle of poverty. But the situation is far more complex than this. In order to receive a high school diploma, students must pass a matriculation exam. But 85% of students fail this exam due to the very poor quality of public education in the country. In fact, no one that I talked to during my visit knew of anyone who had ever passed this exam without paying for after-school tutoring at an extra fee. One 16-year-old boy that I met told me that his parents had sacrificed greatly so that he could stay in school long enough to take the exam. But he, like so many others, had failed it because he could not afford the after-school tutoring. I can't forget the look of complete hopelessness on his face as he told me that his dream of becoming a computer scientist was over because he would now have to do hard labor in a factory, the very same job he would have been forced to take if he had dropped out of school 5 years earlier. I started to worry that it was pointless for me to be there, or worse, that it was somehow immoral for me, a Westerner, to be looking in on this world of abject poverty and hopelessness, while passing judgment on it from my own narrow perspective. The children and parents that I met weren't just poor, they were suffering. Some of them barely had enough to eat, and others were living with severe yet preventable illness or injury because of lack of access to basic medical care. The International Labor Organization, a division of the United Nations, is working on the problem. For the last year, they have been running pilot interventions in 3 areas of Myanmar. Their goal is to find out if their training and free book programs are helping to keep children in school. The hope is that if they are, similar programs can be implemented nationally in an effort to end child labor in Myanmar. Solving this problem won't be easy and will ultimately require addressing both poverty and education in the country. But there is hope, especially if the international community takes an interest in the issue. My own dream is to see a new generation of children in Myanmar who will be able to attend school and who will as adults find jobs that will provide for their own children. I'm working with a documentary filmmaker to tell the story of child labor in Myanmar. We're hoping to play a part in the solution to this problem so that all children in this country will have a chance at reaching their full potential.
Okay, so that explains, sometimes a picture is, as they say, worth 1,000 words. It explains a bit about how this project, at least the empirical part, went at first. But let's talk a little bit about the philosophical component. So we need to ask, what is child labor? We need to ask, why is it a problem in Myanmar? And then we need to ask, why is it even a problem? So I want to go through those three things, or those three questions now. So the problem of child labor is a global one. According to UNICEF, it's not just if a child is working, just a working child isn't a child laborer. So it's a little bit confusing, the term. So it's not about what activities the child is doing, but it's about the consequences of those activities. So anything that negatively affects a child's health or access to education, so health or education, if it negatively affects either of those, then according to UNICEF, it's child labor, because it's a health injustice, because it's an educational injustice. And this is, as you probably know, a problem in a lot of the world. And it's, well, according to the ILO, there are 152 million child laborers worldwide. So that's a lot. It's definitely a global problem, and many of them are really young. Half of them are age 5 to 11. You might think, okay, well, why is that bad? What are the effects of child labor? Perhaps it's obvious. Child labor is often detrimental to health. Children start to work when they're really young, and they don't have a lot to eat often. They work really long hours. Sometimes they work in hazardous or unhealthy conditions, dangerous conditions. They get sick a lot. They get injured. They often die early. Honestly, many people that I met, they would tell me, you know, when I was interviewing parents, they would say, I'm 40 years old, and they looked like they were 65 because they had started working really long hours at age 6, 7, or 8. Of course, also, if a child is working 12 hours a day, even 8 hours a day, then she or he is probably not going to school. So in terms of education, it's very difficult to be a child laborer and go to school. So again, we're not talking about, you know, an after-school job. Many of those had those when we were growing up, me included. We're talking about having to work hours and in certain hours and in certain conditions that make education impossible or nearly impossible. Also, child labor is often a vicious cycle. Child laborers grow up to be low-wage earning adults because they don't have an education, and then they have to send their children out to work. And so it's often passed from generation to generation. Now, in Myanmar in particular, of course, poverty is one of the driving factors. If parents can't afford to buy food, then they're going to send their whole family to work. But in Myanmar, it's not just about poverty. And this is something that I did not understand without the empirical investigation component, without talking to people, without talking to NGO workers, parents, children, et cetera, that something else is going on in Myanmar that's a little bit different than the situation in other countries. Poor quality of public education, that's not specific to Myanmar. It is the case there. Education is mandatory and free up until grade 5, which is about age 11. Well, it's sort of free. You have to buy your own books and you have to buy a uniform, which is required. So even those things are a barrier to very poor families. So if you don't have a uniform, you can't go to school. If you don't buy the books, you can't go to school, so on. But also the government-run schools are, the quality is very low. So children will generally learn to read and write, but usually not anything more than that, unfortunately. 60 to 70, this is on the video, but 60 to 70% of children drop out of school before the 5th grade. So while education is mandatory, nobody really enforces it. You're supposed to stay in school until you're 11, but most children do not. The children who do stay in school, so they have 10 grades. at the end of grade 10, in order to get a high school diploma, and this was referenced in the video, you have to pass this exam. So it's not just enough, like here in the US, you have to take certain classes, get certain grades, and then you get a high school diploma. You have to do those things there, but then you also have to take this exam. I've never seen anything quite like this exam, and I've been an educator for a long time. It takes place over 2 weeks, many hours every day, and it involves memorizing. So I saw the translation into English. I don't read Burmese, but it involves memorizing really long passages and then reciting them word for word. And if you miss, a few words, then you're marked down. And it's very long passages and very random facts. And I looked at this exam and talked to many people about it. And I thought, what is the point of this exam? Is it supposed to measure preparation for university entrance? Is it supposed to be like an SAT or something like that? It doesn't seem like it. Is it supposed to measure whether or not you're prepared for certain jobs? It doesn't seem like it. However, if you don't have a pass on this exam, then not only can you not go to university, but you're also barred from getting most jobs. For example, you can't be a taxi driver without passing this exam. You can't be a store clerk without passing this exam. 85% of people in Myanmar, children in Myanmar, don't pass this exam. So 85% are working in jobs that they don't need the exam for, which is something like making bricks in a factory or cleaning fish, or selling vegetables on the street, so on and so forth. And I thought, this is so strange. What is going on here? And I do think, and I've published a paper on this, that there is an element of strategic injustice here. The government, the military government, which was in place for 50 years, and then it was gone for I guess, how long was it gone for? Maybe 10 years, and now it's back again. They very much control education in the country. They shut down universities for a long time. They recently opened them back up, but hardly any professors are there. And the government, the military government at least, definitely has a history of discouraging higher education in general. And there are lots of reasons for this. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that more in the Q&A if you want to. But in general, I think, and this comes from reading a lot about the history of Myanmar, as well as talking to people there now on my many trips back, that the higher levels of education are generally discouraged because the military sees it as threatening. This is probably not a surprise to those of you who work on global issues or who follow global issues. Many times oppressive regimes don't want the people of the country to be educated because education does wonderful things, but it also causes you to question injustice, for example. Also in Myanmar, not specific to Myanmar, so of these three things on this slide, poor quality of public education, strategic injustice, and gender equity, I see the strategic injustice in terms of this exam is very specific to Myanmar. The other two things are in addition to poverty, but maybe not specific to Myanmar. But there is an element of gender inequity in the job market. It's really hard, let's say, harder for women than men to get jobs in Myanmar. For lots of reasons. There's discrimination against women and in the workplace. And why is this a problem related to child labor? Well, if mom and dad can't work, or if one of the two can't work in a poor family, then they're going to send their children out to work. So those are some of the specifics about the problem in Myanmar in particular. But now let's do a little bit of theoretical philosophy together. So I've told you some details of what child labor is. What does UNICEF say that it is? How do they define it? How many child laborers are there? These are all empirical facts. What do people say on the street when you ask them questions? Those are empirical facts. So that's one part of empirically informed philosophy. The other part is the theory. So why should we care? Why do I care? Why should you care? Why should anyone care about child labor? Why care? You might say, well, that's easy. Child labor causes suffering. Who does it Who suffers? Well, at least the children suffer. We might think that other people suffer too, and I think they do, but at least the child suffers. But maybe we have to dig a little bit deeper. Do they really suffer? Because they don't know anything different. They don't know anything different. It's what everyone does. It's what they do. It's what their parents did. It's what their grandparents did. It's what their friends do. It's how life is. So maybe problem solved. There's no problem of child labor. It's just what they do. But a simple thought experiment, which is a tool that philosophers use when we're practicing theoretical philosophy, I think shows that that doesn't work. It's wrong. So here's a thought experiment. Imagine that there's a child who's born, and from the moment of birth, she's poked with a sharp object every minute, let's say. And it's not enough to cause serious harm, but it causes pain. And this child is not going to know anything different from the moment of birth to the moment of death. She's going to be poked by this sharp object. But she's going to feel pain. She's going to suffer. So just because someone doesn't know anything different doesn't mean that they don't suffer. So child labor causes suffering, even if they don't know anything different. Another objection, and you might think of this one as, maybe think of this as a more serious objection. I now, over the past several years, have learned quite a lot about child labor in other countries. And in Peru, for example, there is a movement there to empower and support child laborers because, and this is the reason given, when asked, child laborers in Peru, and actually I found this to be the case in Myanmar as well, when asked, do you want to work? More often than not say yes. So we should let them do what they want. They want to work. But we have to think a little bit more deeply about this as well, right? Do they say they want to work? Not all of them all the time, but many of them do, yes. They'll say yes, they want to work. But what are they saying? They're probably saying, I want to eat. I don't want to die of starvation. I want my family to live in a hut and not on the open ground with nothing over their heads, right? And so many times when I was talking to families, I was just really struck by the fact that so many just thought things couldn't be any other way. And so on the one hand, this was hard to deal with. It was depressing. But on the other hand, we know that there is hope. From global experience, we know that child labor doesn't have to be the case. For example, here in the United States in the early 1900s, some of you know this, child labor in factories was really common. And it didn't change until there was a photography campaign, a very brave and ingenious photographer named Lewis Hines snuck into factories, pretended to be an inspector, and took photographs of children working, published them in the New York Times, and then people began to lobby Congress and say, this needs to change, because they saw it. And so things can change. They changed here. We've seen positive change in other countries as well. So it doesn't have to be the case. Things can change, I think, in Myanmar too. Okay, so what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is what we're doing right now. We can learn about this. We can become aware. That is the idea behind this documentary that we are hoping to make. More on that in a moment, on the status of that in a moment. Because, you know, when people see something, that's usually when they start to care. And I publish a lot of academic papers. Probably not that many people read them. I have a book forthcoming in July. Hopefully someone will read it. But people usually will watch a documentary before going to an academic paper, and it will it has the possibility of reaching a larger audience. So getting the word out is really important. It's also important, and it was really important for me in my work to know that that's what people in Myanmar want, right? So we don't want to display this problem to the world, so to speak, if it's not something that people want. But across the board, when I would ask people, you know, they would ask where I was from, and I would say from America. They don't refer to it as the United States, they call it America. And they would say, tell people in America, you know, tell people in America what it's like for us here. So becoming aware, the part of this project is to raise awareness. But then after you raise awareness, what do you do next? I think that absolutely educational injustice in the country needs to be addressed. That has already started. So my fourth trip, the video you watched was about my second trip, so it's a little bit old. But by the time of my fourth trip, which was just a little over a year ago now, I was supposed to be in Myanmar, actually, now again, but the coup happened. So, but during the time of my fourth trip, I had the chance to talk with people who are working on changing this exam. I think they should just get rid of it, but at least changing the exam, lobbying to pay teachers more, to train teachers better, things like that. So there is a movement that's starting, or at least was starting before the military took over, to address this problem of education in the country. Also, promoting gender equity. This is something that has been successfully done in other countries with educational campaigns. So I do think there's possibility for that. So raising awareness, addressing educational injustice, promoting gender equity in the workplace. These things I really do think can change things. Honestly, it can change things in Myanmar. But there are challenges moving forward. There was and there is strong resistance from the government. For example, on my last trip, I was heavily scrutinized by whoever looks at visa applications, because to do the work that I do there, I can't go on a tourist visa. I have to get a research visa, and I was denied a research visa and denied camera privileges. So I couldn't take a camera. That's why I'm showing you an old video, because I couldn't take a camera with me. So the film director ended up not going on this last visit, and I had to weigh whether or not it was a good idea for me to go for safety reasons. For other reasons, and I decided, okay, I'll go on a tourist visa. I will not use a camera. I will, just meet with the United Nations. I'll meet with teachers and things like that. I won't interview any children so that I don't get in trouble. I was able to do that. There were government minders that would show up now and again and make sure that I didn't have a camera. So there was a strong element of resistance at the time, and I think even more so right now. Right now, there are closed borders, first because of COVID, then because of the coup. And so, when all of this happened in the last few months, very devastating for the people there, very devastating for my friends who are there, and pretty frustrating for me as well, because for the moment, the documentary is on hold. But I've been thinking a lot about this situation, and I don't know. Obviously, I have no idea how long the military will be in control. But I know that when things open up again, it will be the right time for reform in many ways. Democratic reform, educational reform too. And that time is coming. I don't know when it is. And I hope that we can be ready for it, because I do see hope for change and for the people there, for my friends there. Okay, so I could talk a long time, but I'd like to save adequate time for Q&A. So just to wrap up here in a minute or two, what was this talk about? The story of child labor in Myanmar. I told you that I'm a philosopher. I told you how I tried to bring together in this work that I'm doing on this issue both theoretical tools. Why is child labor bad? What is child labor anyway? And empirical research. What do child laborers say? What do government officials say, etc.? Bringing together these two things, theory and empirical data, trying to first understand the problem and then trying to make recommendations for change. Okay, and with that, I will answer questions.
Thank Thank you very much, Ashley. Just as a reminder, if you have any question for our speaker today, please use the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. You can type your question there, and we're going to go through them as they come in. You mentioned, Ashley, the reforms that we had in Europe and in England, I'm thinking about, and also here in the US, but they were internal, if you like, for the most part, right? And the government was more or less willing to look at it. I mean, it still required quite a bit of a reform, but we didn't have the same regime, if you like, in place as is the case in Myanmar. How do you see, what parallels do you really see, and what you mentioned a little bit the difficulties with the government, and that the government, of course, is purposefully keeping many of the individuals, the population, from getting educated, so they're not being a threat. But thinking of the reforms that happened in Europe and happened here in the US, what steps do you think, apart from, you mentioned the reporter, the photographer who would take pictures and bring them up to the government, that I would assume wouldn't really work there, because the government, I'm assuming in Myanmar, knows about it and is fine with it, right? So should, in this case, the help come more from the outside world, or what would your perspective be?
Yeah, it's a good question, and this is not a simple problem. I am not in any way saying this is a simple problem to solve. I'm just saying there's no such thing as an impossible problem, which I truly believe. So right now, I don't think anything can be done. Nobody can get in or out, and people are literally running for their lives from the police and the military, every day because of these demonstrations. But what I see as hope for the future is that this situation, this critical situation in Myanmar, isn't going to last forever. I don't know what's going to happen. Are they going to have democratic elections in a year? Maybe. Will the military be in rule for many years? Maybe. But it will open up again. And people on the inside are going to be ready for reform. And they're going to be asking for help from the international community. Absolutely. So I don't think it's you can't come in from the outside and say, hey, guess what? I'm from America and I'm going to tell you what to do. But I do think that there's already a movement starting. And so coming alongside and supporting that movement is something we actually absolutely can do. At this very moment, today in April, it's frustrating. I can't get in. No one can either. So I think we do have to wait. But I think that the opportunity for change is actually going to be even stronger when this oppressive regime is no longer in place.
I want to follow up on something you've said a couple of times, that of course we shouldn't, and we don't want to go in as Americans or wherever else we're coming from, saying, okay, here's what you need to do, right? And you need to care and do things the way we do it. I would imagine one of the things that is difficult for us who grew up in a completely different world almost, to imagine what it is like to grow up in Myanmar as a child, right? Because for them, that is the norm, right? That's normal, right? That's what they see around it. And then their whole families growing up like this. Can they even imagine what it would be like to have a different life and not, because for them it's a matter of survival, right? It's I would imagine, and I'm making this up obviously, that it's almost drilled in you that if you don't work, you're going to starve and your family will starve, so it's your responsibility to go work and help your family so everybody can survive. Can they imagine a different world?
Sometimes no. But that's why, so there are also people in Myanmar who weren't child laborers, right? And so no, sometimes when you're in survival mode, here at home, I work as a guardian ad litem. So working with children who have been put into the foster system because they've been abused, abandoned, or neglected many, many times. It turns out that there is a long history of abuse, of domestic spousal abuse, of child abuse. And many times those families think this is normal, and it is normal, but normal is not the same thing as good.
Mhm.
And so just because something is normal, and because at that moment, sometimes, when I walk into the home here in the US, there's this idea, well, you can't change it. This is the way it is. This is how my mom was. This is how my grandmother was. And sometimes it does take someone else to hold that candle of hope for a little while. But then people do start to see, okay, maybe there could be change. So I don't see it as a permanent barrier. Yeah, of course. Anyone who's in survival mode, whether that's because they're a child laborer or they're a victim of spousal violence, at that moment, they might not have they're just, can I live through this kind of thought? But that's why, it takes partnerships.
Right. And maybe show that there is a choice, right? You have a choice and it's not like you're predestined.
Well, it has to be, at the moment, many of them don't have a choice. So we have to provide an environment and such that there is a choice, right?
Right. And that's I think where we could potentially help with. I have a completely different question here by one of our attendees. When you showed the video, there was something on the cheeks of the children. So the question
I've never showed that video, whether that's to a friend or students or whatever, without that question. That's called Tanaka. And it comes from the bark of a tree, which is ground and then mixed with water and made into a paste. And men, women, and children use it. And it does act as a sunscreen, but really it's more as a, cosmetic thing. And they'll sometimes just spread it on however, and sometimes they'll have patterns and really, cool designs. I have never seen it in any other country. I've traveled quite extensively, and it's very specific to Myanmar. So it's a pretty cool thing. That's actually the working title of the documentary, Tanaka. Because it's a very specific Myanmar tradition.
Very interesting. Okay, here's another question from one of our attendees. In Vietnam and China, a lot of people struggled through the system, talking about the exam and the educational system, and often committed suicide over results from the first shot national exam. Do you see anything like that? And have you observed any tendencies that people are so devastated when they don't make it through that exam that they even commit suicide?
No, they lose hope, and and they think, okay, well, I just have to work in the factory. But I think partly, I don't know about Vietnam, I'm not familiar with that, but China I'm more familiar with. It's a high academic standard that they're supposed to reach. In Myanmar, this exam is like so crazy and so impossible. So they don't feel like I failed academically, I wish I was smarter. It's more just like I didn't have enough money to pay the right tutor to give me the answers ahead of time, which is what rich people do. So there's definitely a loss of hope, but it's not connected to academic achievement or identity. Does that make sense? So they definitely think, oh, well, I didn't pass it, so I can't go to school anymore. I have to work in the factory, but it isn't tied to academic achievement because it's
right. Now, I would imagine in Myanmar, because it's a matter of survival if you're working or not, and for your whole family, you cannot abandon your family if you're committing suicide, right?
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Coming back to going, with the problems to the government, it's a very similar question to what we already talked about. How could anyone reasonably contest the government given their iron fist on the country's populace? And if anything, the issues with legitimacy of the government are deeply systemic, and likely only best influenced via economic power or through smaller scale interventions. Do you have any thoughts on that? What would work best? Economic powers, smaller interventions, kind of like similar to what you're hoping to do by raising a
yeah. I don't know, because I don't know about that in other countries either. But it's difficult. I mean, in Myanmar, well, I mean, I guess I do have a little bit to say. I don't have the solution. Economic sanctions, they don't care about that. They being the military. I mean, they were closed for 50 years. So that definitely won't work. I mean, I guess it's a nice gesture for the United States to do that. I mean, rather than doing nothing, that absolutely won't work. Well, it hasn't worked. I mean, it's hard to say what would work. And, no one wants to send troops there or anything like that.
Right.
And I don't even know if that would work. But economic sanctions, no, they don't care. They've been self-sufficient for all that time. So it's symbolic, but it won't change things.
If there was a perfect solution, maybe we would already, or somebody would already have pursued it, right? So you mentioned very briefly that child labor is, of course, not limited to Myanmar.
Right.
How does the situation in Myanmar compare to other child labor situations in the rest of the world, or other parts of the world?
So UNICEF ranks it as the second worst place after North Korea. And what do you mean by worst? In terms of the number of children, the age of the children, and the jobs that they have to do. So it's bad. You can go online and, sometimes these things you might change. Maybe it'll slip into third place or something like that, but it's always in the top few. So it's not the worst, but it's one of the worst places.
Mm-hmm. Is child sex trafficking also a problem in Myanmar?
Yes, but going out of the country into Thailand. So in Thailand, if some of you are familiar with this, if you know anything about sex trafficking of children, Thailand is notorious for people, especially from Europe, coming on what they call sex vacations. And many of those children are actually not Thai children. They're actually children from Myanmar that are taken across the border. So yes, you don't necessarily see it happening in Myanmar for the reason I just said. They're taken across the border into Thailand.
Kind of related to that, is there a lot of efflux out of the country to try and make a better life elsewhere out of the country, just by not necessarily taking your kids outside, but the whole families?
Mostly no, because it's not easy to get visas to go to other places. So no. Now that's of course not the case with friends that I have there that are expats, working at the United Nations or at NGOs or things like that. I mean, many of them left after the coup, but in terms of Myanmar people, it's not easy to go somewhere else. It's really not easy at all.
Okay. How is the UN and its 2030 agenda responding to this situation?
Yeah, so they have this project called the Myanmar Prevention of Child Labor, and I need to check actually and see if they're going to renew. Actually, it's hard because the internet is down almost all the time now in Myanmar. So I actually haven't heard recently from my contacts at the ILO in Yangon. Are you continuing this project given the situation? So they previously had a long-term project supported by the United Nations, and I don't know the status of that right now. I actually don't know if they know the status of that right now. So I guess I can't give you a good answer to that question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it's all a little bit put sideways because of the coup right now, right? Okay, coming back on how to help the population in Myanmar, are you familiar with any informal economic practices or that could benefit from a more robust support to supplant or alleviate some of the immediate economic pressures of the people?
Yes, and you might want to email me later and we can talk about that. The other thing is, I didn't talk about this in the presentation to save time, but there are, or at least there were before the coup, I don't know if they'll be allowed anymore, but I hope so. A lot of informal schools, they're called informal schools. It doesn't mean the schooling itself is informal. It just means not run by the government, that were popping up. And I got to talk to some of the teachers and the education was quite good. Now it's tricky because the government was allowing them, but then they wouldn't allow you to take the matriculation exam if you didn't go to a government school. However, some children were getting a good enough education that they were able to even take the SAT. And in some cases now, obviously this requires donors. Either they could be rich, but that's rare in Myanmar, or an outside donor. And going to school, in Singapore or the UK or the US and so on and so forth. So that's another way forward. So if you don't take the matriculation exam, you could never go to university in Myanmar or get certain jobs in Myanmar. So they would have to sacrifice that, but they might be willing to do that,
Right.
So yes, there are some informal NGOs that are, well, the NGOs aren't informal, NGOs that are doing these sorts of informal programs. Yes. Yes.
One of the questions here is related to what the root issue is for the extreme poverty that is in Myanmar, and whether it's a debt-oriented currency system.
Yeah.
Do you have any knowledge on that?
The only thing I can say about that is that the extreme poverty came during the 50 years of oppressive rule by the military. There was nothing, no foreign investment, these things are not always necessarily good, but there was none of that. And things were actually getting a little bit better between 2010 and 2020, more opportunities for people. But I guess just similar to North Korea, the same reasons. Why are people poor there? Well, if they're not able to have any kind of job opportunity, then there's, what else are you, going to do? So, yeah.
Coming back to that qualifying exam, whatever it's called there, you mentioned that 85% or so of the students do not pass the exam, but then like 15 or 20 or so do. The question here is, what do these individuals do that are actually passing that exam? And would they be in a good place to advocate for an educational reform?
Yeah, so I didn't hear the first part of the question. I heard the second part, would they be able to advocate, but what was the first?
And just if they, what they're actually doing after they're passing the exam. You mentioned you even driver or something.
So that's interesting. So if they pass the exam, they can go to university. Unfortunately, universities in Myanmar the situation is, I'm not sure if it's possible to be worse than the grade 1 through 10 schools, but I think it could be the case. For example, I met someone who had a computer science degree who had never owned or used a computer, because what they do is they just write these diplomas and say, here you go, because there's no one there that can teach computer science. Even scarier, medical doctors who have never observed or performed a surgery, and they're supposed to perform a surgery. So most people don't go to the doctor. I certainly had, an emergency plan in place where I bought travel insurance. I'm not rich, I'm a professor. And I said, the travel insurance was enough to cover a flight to Thailand where you can get good medical care, even for something like, a laceration, which could easily happen on the trips I was doing, or a broken leg. I taught myself to give injections, do stitches, things like that. Just emergency medicine. I'm not a medical doctor, and I didn't need to do it, although I did, but I was prepared and had a small kit with things like that. So that's the downside. Now, students that come from very rich families often will go to Singapore or Australia or the UK or the US and get an education. Many of them don't return to Myanmar, though. But I think, maybe that could change in the future, right? If there's a ray of hope. Right now, the military took back over, I'm not sure that they'll be able to leave. But in the past, it was either you go to school in Myanmar and you don't actually have a degree. You have a diploma, but you don't have the training. Or you're fortunate enough to get training elsewhere, and then you generally stay elsewhere. Yeah.
Do you see any proposition for an educational reform among those people, though? The ones that are passing?
There are some. So I did meet some teachers that are really committed to and excited about the possibility of educational reform, and it had even started. Just a little over a year ago, the visit where I was denied camera access, I thought I'll still try to make use of this visit. And a lot of what I was doing was talking to teachers who were starting these informal schools, and basically, trying things out and hoping that eventually, the government would see, hey, this could be actually good for everyone. Well, it's not so simple, but even if those children are getting an education, it's still not for nothing.
Yeah. Thank you, Ashley. We're out of time. I know we have a couple more questions, and I think the last are require a lot more explanation. So I'm going to send those to you after we get off. And please look for the answers to the questions on our website in a couple of days or so. That is FAU Division of Research, Research in Action. With that, thank you very much. Thanks, Ashley. Hope to see you next week, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.